Hey folks, my name is Ted and welcome to the Business of Cyber Series podcast. Super excited to talk to you about 62443 3-2 deep dive. And just to give you a little bit of context, we're talking about critical infrastructure, we're talking about cybersecurity, and we're talking about the business outcomes that we have to connect these investments to really make sure that we have the budgets we need, we're using the time that is limited, and we're also focused on the right people. And to help do that, we have been diving into the 62443 series of standards. Now, last week, or maybe the week before, about 10 days ago, we had the ISA program manager come on, Andre Restaino. We had the most viewers during the actual event, and then post-event, we had the most viewers that we've ever had. And what our topic was, how do you get started with ISA IEC 62443? Where did it come from? What are the different series or standards within the series? And there were so many comments. There was so much positive kind of remarks. What we decided to do is put a poll out, and we said, what are the 4 different topics that we could possibly talk about in the coming weeks? And it was overwhelmingly evident, based on the feedback, that a deep dive into 3-2, which I think is the most widely talked about standard in critical infrastructure, in ICS, in OT, people wanted to know about what that really was, what it's about, how do you get started? And so reached out to the ecosystem, and I can tell you that we are in store for a really, really great conversation today, because I'm going to be joined by an industry expert, really, really renowned within the Houston, Texas, and the oil and gas industry here, a gentleman by the name of Kenny Mesker. Now, he's the vice board chair of the ISA Security Compliance Institute, and he really works hand in hand with a lot of the different major operators, a lot of the thought leaders in the space. And we are really, really privileged to have him on the Business of Cyber show today, because he's one of the contributing authors to IEC 62443 3-2, Security Risk Assessment for System Design. So Kenny, welcome to the show. Thanks for taking such time out of your schedule to help the ecosystem learn a little bit more about this standard, how to use it, and we're really excited to have you.
Oh, thank you, Ted. I really appreciate you inviting me, and thanks to the entire SecurityGate team. It's been really great privilege to be here. Would you like me to briefly discuss my kind of background a little bit, and
Yeah.
we can lead on?
I mean, for folks like you and I have known each other for, I think, going on 5 or 6 years, and your wealth of knowledge in OT and cybersecurity in way major enterprises and organizations manage their risk, right? Tell the audience a little bit about what takes up the majority of your time as it relates to this topic.
Sure. So I'm one of those, we call it in the industry kind of those unicorns, right? The people who started out on the operations focus side. I'm an engineer by background and education, and over time worked my way through operations on the vendor supplier side of process automation into asset owner. And of course, now, as you can see on my slide there, I'm with Chevron. And what I do day to day is it's interesting, because folks that have that kind of background, that started out in a fairly operational mode and sort of wound up in a big company asset owner vertically integrated environment. I have a lot of war stories, obviously, that help influence how I do things, and so that puts me in a unique position within large organization and within industry groups outside, is that I can kind of act as a go-between advisor, because I speak all the
Yeah,
languages. I speak IT, I speak operations, I speak risk management, and so forth. So I'm in a well-positioned place where day to
sure.
day I'm either interfacing with executives or folks in the field, literally.
Yeah, it's funny because although I don't have the breadth of experience that you do, I came from the operations side myself. So former military officer, I jumped into the oil and gas industry actually as a root cause failure analysis auditor. So when a tool failed downhole, they'd send me in. So it was a very hard hat, operationally focused, steel toe business, but it required an understanding of risk management, auditing processes. So what I always like to tell people is I'm not the OT or the ICS expert by any means. I come from the auditing and the assessment background. And so in my day-to-day world, I'm constantly engaging with asset owners, primarily in the C-suite and the security realm. And their challenges are always, what do I need to assess? What do I assess to? Do I need to audit myself? Do I have the team to audit myself? And in this entire kind of world of improvement, what are the different things that ICS or OT critical infrastructure players really need to focus on. And I think you and I would align. If you don't have an understanding of the engineering, if you don't have the understanding of either the shop floor or the rig or the vessel, it's going to be challenging to understand the business impacts or the business outcomes. And that's what I like about IEC 62443-3-2. Viviana, will you take us to the next slide? What we've got lined up today, Kenny, is obviously we'd love to understand from a contributing author's perspective, what's the overall journey of 62443? We covered a lot of that about 2 weeks ago, but as it relates to someone who's actually telling the story and building that engineering kind of workflow, we look forward to kind of hearing that from you. And I love that you commented on your operational engineering background. Love for you to take a dive into 3-2, right? And then really when you look at kind of some of the outputs of 3-2, I'd love for the ecosystem to understand, where do zones and conduits play in, right? What is a detailed risk assessment? What are some of the kind of the foundations or the precursors to those detailed risk assessments? And I think we've got some content here that we can share on the screen to cover those things, correct?
Yes. So the brief highlight here, I mean, there's a lot of material to cover, and we're going to cover it in oncoming slides. So I don't want to bury the lead, but
right.
The journey sort of, so there's ISA, International Society of Automation. So they recognized that there was no specifically, and I'm going to use a lot of terms that I hope everybody understands, OT, operational technology, versus IT. That's a really good distinction to make between our world and OT and, the traditional IT world, that there were no mature standard series standards for cybersecurity that were originated from a desire to improve the industrial automation and control system space. And so they formed a group in ISA called ISA 99. And that group is focused on cybersecurity. And we began work on the standard series. Now I got involved kind of midstream. The work was already fairly matured, and they started forming working groups to create the individual series components. The working group I wound up in was the group that was developing it was ISA 99-3-2.
Right.
We'll get into why it's called 62443 in a minute. And we had already laid out a framework of how that series was expected to look, what the component elements were. And that framework hasn't really deviated in the last decade. And so,
which I think is a good thing, by the way.
Well, yeah, that's a good thing. It shows permanence, and it's actually working the way it's supposed to.
Sure.
3-2 in particular spoke to something that's near and dear to my heart, which is, as mentioned, risk analysis. That includes risk management, risk assessment, all things risk. When I came into the cybersecurity space in process automation, I was lucky, I guess is the word I would use, to be included in some early stage risk assessments that were going on, and they were, to put it mildly, terrible. We just did not have the maturity, we did not have the capacity to do that kind of thing, and it was just something that stuck with me. I had to solve that problem. So among other things, that was a good reason for me to get involved with 3-2, which was addressing the very concept of establishing risk, but you need a context, right? And so Absolutely. The context is zones and conduits. Sure. So I'd have to say, if you look at the name of 62443-3-2, risk assessment plays prominently in the name. It's not a misnomer, but it does, again, sort of deprecate the actual heart of what's going on, which is establishing these zones and conduits, which we'll talk about in more detail here shortly.
Yeah. No, it's a great overview. And we will have a slide here in a moment. For those of you who missed about 10 days ago, we did an overview of 62443. You can catch that on my LinkedIn profile. It gets you a real understanding of all the different standards in the series. While we go through this exercise, we have the capability to take a look at questions, comments, likes, any shares that you do. If you have a comment or a question, feel free to put it up in the chat, and we will try to address it if we can. Viviana, let's go to the next slide. What I wanted to do is just kind of set the scene. What is 3-2, right? Well, what we're talking about is we're talking about a document that we'll get deep dive into, but what you should know is it's a little bit different than some of the frameworks and some of the regulatory guidelines that you have out there. When you think about an assessment, NIST CSF, when you think about maybe even GDPR, when you think about TSA pipeline, when you think about all these different standards, frameworks, or regulatory requirements that are out there, many times what they do is they make a recommendation or a preference or a minimal standard to a number of controls. You map those controls to your overall work processes, and you can kind of give yourself an idea of whether or not you're meeting that standard or whether you can improve, right? 3-2 takes a really different approach. It's a deeper approach, and it's because the authors knew that for OT and IECS environments, you have to correlate a lot more things because every site may be different, every system or every zone may be different. So when you take a look at this quick sheet, a couple different facts that I want to just kind of lay as our top level understanding to set the framework here. So this is a risk assessment and system design for IACS. And the primary audience is, in my opinion, asset owners as well as system integrators, okay? It's about 30 pages long. It's not a heavy read, but it is a heavy lift when you start to think about implementation. And the reason is, this isn't really like a controls framework. This isn't saying, hey, here are all of the different recommendations for controls like you would see on a NIST. This is more of a workflow, an engineering workflow. Now, here's the thing. I always encourage people that go on a 3-2 journey to pull in previous risk assessments, previous data models, and primarily control models, because if you don't know what controls you have for a given system or a given kind of domain, then you're not going to be able to fulfill some of the asks that the 3-2 workflow requests. So what Kenny is going to dive into, and I'm really excited about, is what makes 3-2 different is it really is a workflow designed for continual improvement. And I think that's where it really segments itself away from other standards and regulatory requirements. Because you've got to take threats. You got to take the vulnerabilities that are inherent with some of your systems. You got to take the likelihood that those vulnerabilities are going to be kind of taken advantage of by the threats. You got to look at the consequences to your business operations. And finally, you have to ask yourself, what's our risk tolerance? And what's the target security level? And are we able to accept that? And then the continual process, correct me if I'm wrong, Kenny, the continual process that the authors really designed was, how do I offer a systematic, repeatable approach that's rooted in an engineering mindset to not only assess the risk, but say, if this is our risk, here are all the other controls we're going to put in place. Here's the mitigating controls. Here's the countermeasures to try to reduce the likelihood of some sort of consequence. Kenny, that's my perspective on where 3-2 really segments itself in a differentiated fashion. And I've said many times that 3-2 is the most widely requested and the one kind of standard that's in demand the most, but it has the fewest people that can actually go and do it or do it successfully. Your take, sir.
Yeah, when you look at the various, and I'm going to pick on risk analysis here for just a second. When you look at the various methodologies, publications, et cetera, I mean, there's everything from NIST, the NIST 800 series, NIST 830. You've got various maturity, the C2M2 models for measuring maturity. If you go follow CISA right now under the Department of Homeland Security, they've got all kinds of things they're publishing, and none of these are particularly bad per se. But to kind of be a little repetitive, they are coming from a very IT-centric viewpoint. And what anyone who's worked in this industry for any length of real time realizes very quickly that there's a lot of similarity between currently existing OT and IT environments, but those differences seldom get taken into account when it comes to things like risk analysis. And so building a workflow, number one, establishes a consistent methodology for determining, measuring, and analyzing and determining risk, identifying risk, all those sorts of things. And if you also look across the entire breadth, and believe me, I can do several webinars on risk analysis, so I won't go there. But quickly, if you look across the breadth of industries that are involved in the risk game, you have financial, which they typically measure things in terms of volatility. You've got home, auto, and life insurance, and they measure things according to actuarial tables. They have a lot of history that they can depend on. You have all these various, very well working, in the nuclear physics world, you've got statistical simulations you can do, create models and that sort of thing. And when it comes to OT, and particularly cybersecurity in OT, we don't have a lot of history. Now, unfortunately, that's changing, or, I guess if you're trying to measure risk, fortunately, because you're getting more data points, but it's data points we don't want to get, right? And so when you come at the cybersecurity question, when you're doing risk analysis in an OT environment, you don't have those things that you can leverage from those other or those other sectors. And so you have to sort of start from the bottom up. And one of the most important things is that you have a repeatable methodology that is component based. And when you were talking earlier about threats, vulnerabilities, consequence, impact, likelihoods, those are components. And so a component based approach to risk analysis is without a doubt the most important aspect of this whole thing. So there's one takeaway. It's that when you're doing risk analysis in this kind of environment, break things down into those individual components, measure or at least estimate the values of those individual components, and then draw them back together again. It really is quite simple. People tend to overcomplicate it. I have been a victim of overcomplicating it, but 62443 attempts to lay it out in pretty concise, stepwise detail.
Well, I appreciate that feedback, and you bring up a great point about overcomplicating things. And if we can go ahead and go to the next slide, Viviana, my perspective, Kenny, and this maybe will finalize the overall foundation that we've set here. There are a wide array of experience levels within the, let's say, ICS or critical infrastructure community for security. You've got people that are really, really new. They're trying to learn what standards are out there. Where do I want to focus my next 5 years of growth? You've got people on the opposite end of the spectrum that have been doing it for 20 to 25, some self-proclaimed experts, some are experts because they've been in the field every day. And what it really kind of bothers me is there's some experts out there that think that this is so hard, it's impossible for you to learn in a webinar, it's impossible for you to learn in a class, so don't try to learn it. And I think in order for critical infrastructure to be secure, that can't be our only answer. We've got to work as an ecosystem to try to not overcomplicate things. What I love about 3-2 is it is altered less than other frameworks and standards that I see. I'll give you the last point on that before we transition into really the meat of your presentation and talk here.
Yeah, I mean, those are all good points. Obviously, like you said, the fact is, it hasn't changed much. I would say probably the last point I would make is that while it is easy is probably not the right word, but at least accessible to create, kind of an easy to follow workflow, the real lessons come in the details, right? The saying, the devil's in the details. I would say that the 62443 standard suffers from at least one problem that a lot of other like standards have, and that is there's a lot of step one, do some stuff that you do uniquely for your organization, step two, right? And so in those little do the things that are unique to your organization gaps, there's a wealth of knowledge that needs to be tapped into. And generally speaking, I found that any reasonably sized organization has people that have thought about every single problem or every single challenge that's in the workflow. They just haven't thought about it in the context of OT. So the machine is there. It just hasn't been running on that type of fuel before. And if you can tap into that and say, hey, look, what you do is 95% of what we need over here in the OT environment. Let me teach you the little OT parts that you need. Turns out you have a lot more capability than you think you have.
Very good. Well, listen, let's dive in. We've got, folks, about 10 to 12 slides that Kenny has kind of proposed as really good foundational learning points. Kenny, let's kick it off with the what. I think you commented a little bit about understanding the kind of the context of the business. I pass it over to you, sir.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we can flip to the next slide, I think we get the conversation rolling.
So let's flip to the next slide, V. Perfect.
So just quick understanding, 62443 is not a standard in the traditional sense. It is a series of standards. Think of it as a library of them. They currently run from 1 to 4. So there's sections 1 through 4. 1 is very general overview, sets the level, has the glossary, talks about principal concepts. It's just all the level setting kind of background reference material you need to enjoy the rest of the series. And then 2 is very much the asset owners. It talks about sort of how organizational pieces work, still big picture. So where the real interest for me starts is 3 for some obvious reasons and some not so obvious reasons. 3 is what we say it's targeting system integrators, but I would argue that most, especially large organizations in any given critical infrastructure sector, are often their own system integrators. We obviously hire system integrators to come deploy systems to work on major capital projects and those kinds of things. But if you really think about it, the large bulk of system integration is happening day to day in those environments. And so a lot of this does in fact apply to us that are doing system integration. And then 4, which is the relatively newer parts of the series, is component oriented. So there's 4-1 and 4-2 of note. 4-1 is the software security development lifecycle. So the components of development that produce good products. And then there's 4-2, which is component level. So what are the individual requirements for components to fit into a cybersecurity strategy? And right there in the 3 series lives 3-2, which is where zones and conduits is brought in. And within the context of zones and conduits is, and which we'll talk about in a minute in more detail, is also the ability to establish risk analysis.
Got it. And we're going to have actually, I think either next week or the following, we're going to be diving into all of these different chapters or subchapters as part of the series from a training perspective. Real quick question before we go to the next slide. How important do you think it is, Kenny, for organizations that are in the early stages of adopting the 3-2 workflow, that they help us understand a little bit of the outputs that you would be looking for from 1 and 2? Because we know 4 is more for a different kind of, for the suppliers, right? What would you be looking for that the asset owners or the integrators have been able to say that they've done on 1 and 2 to position them for 3-2?
Yeah. So I would start off by saying it's not progressive. So you don't necessarily have to start, at 1 and work your way to 4. It's all at once. They just cover different aspects of the series. I would say the takeaways, we do have occasional conversations about things in 1 and 2, because 1 is definitely your go-to when you're trying to establish what did they mean by X, right? And so when you're trying to get clarity on something, you go back to 1, and like I said, the glossary lives there. A lot of the core principles live there. So if you want clarity of something, because it's a fairly straightforward series, but at the same time, there's new terminology and it's used in certain ways. And anything written by committee is always going to, need a little interpretation. And so 1 is there for you to use that. 2 is very much, like I said, it's asset owner oriented. So it's more about like what it is you should be thinking about, big picture.
Right.
You should be thinking about things like zones and conduits, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. It just says, you need an architecture that meets your needs. You need the right workflows to meet your needs as far as, initial, ongoing, run and maintain, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it's still pretty big picture. And all of that is, I personally dove into 3 first. When I started my journey, I started with 3-3. I'm like, well, I know standards and I understand controls. I'm going to go read those, right? I did myself a bit of a disservice in that. I have since corrected that, but in doing so, I treated it like it was any other set of controls. And that's not true, right? It's a rich tapestry. The series represents the entire. I don't want to reuse the word ecosystem, but it's an ecosystem of cybersecurity thought, right? And if you just go into one of them thinking I'm going to find the solution to my problem here, you're probably doing yourself a little bit of a disservice. You need to go take a look at the others as well.
Understood. So let's dive into zones and conduits. What are they? What aren't they? And then we'll dive into a little bit more of even the Purdue model as we keep going here.
Right. So I've answered this question probably a million times in the last 3 years, and I've yet to come up with the perfectly concise answer, but I've tried. I've got my little elevator speech. I would say zones and conduits is an architectural reference specification that is more abstract than anything that you know today. What you probably are familiar with, if you're in the IECS world, is the Purdue model. The Purdue model has been our friend for a long time. It served us very well. It is a relatively rigid architecture, and it definitely is having some growing pains or struggles getting through industry Industry 3.0, 4.0, 5.0 is coming, and so as the environments change, as we introduce other concepts, cloud, IIoT, et cetera, the original constraint of the Purdue model sort of falls apart. So what you need is this abstract concept that gives you the building blocks. The zones and conduits can be thought of as, I think of them as Tinker Toys sometimes. They're the building blocks that you can use to build any type of architecture you want, and still represent, principally your cybersecurity interests, right? And one of the big pluses, the third bullet on the slide there, is that I can go on and on about compliance. Compliance is something that we're all very familiar with. It is by far not the entire cybersecurity solution, but most operations groups are looking for ways to reduce that compliance burden. Because of the way the Purdue model groups things, usually you see a lot of flat networks. You see a lot of assets sitting in one big, zone, so to speak. And compliance can't be applied individually, or else you're in for a world of hurt. So you wind up just kind of broad brushing with compliance, and that hurts everyone. You're applying certain levels of compliance rigor to things that don't need it. And if you can segment or isolate different functional groupings of your assets and say, this grouping deserves more compliance rigor, but the rest of it doesn't, you can actually save yourself a lot of time. And then the slide went away, but one of the kind of a joke, but on the right side, it's not just a bunch of rectangles on a Visio diagram. I've seen people start the 62443 journey, and they take their Purdue model and they just draw diagram or rectangles and say, now I have a zones and conduits. Well, no, there's a lot more to it. So don't think that it's that simple, although it is not as complicated as you might think.
Right. Do you want to stay here and keep talking about this, or move to zones?
We can move on in the interest of time.
Okay. So let's do zones and conduit, or excuse me, let's look at the Purdue model, and maybe you could illuminate some of the kind of the pluses and the minuses here of, and we talked about this before the show, is this is what a lot of people have, it wasn't originally built for OT security in any way, shape, or form. So what are the misconceptions about Purdue model being part of the conversation when we start talking about zones, conduits, and systems under consideration?
Right. So the Purdue model, while it did in part have security in mind, right? It was sorry, I suddenly have a screen. Okay, yeah, my screen locked on me. So the Purdue model was it's supposed to create a ubiquitous architectural concept that allows us to between partners within our own companies, between sectors, we can speak the same language. I mean, and it did a pretty spectacular job at doing that. Likewise, it created some what we call defense in depth sort of concepts, right? Where you say, all right, I have the outside world and I don't trust it, and I have my squishy center that's extremely critical, and I want to do all the things I can to keep the outside world from touching my squishy center. Some call it the egg model, right? Where you've got the hard shell on the outside and mushy stuff on the inside. But it's not very flexible. And you find that out very quickly when you start trying to deal with real world architectures that, for example, let's say you've got offshore platforms, and those offshore platforms represent, levels 0 through 3, right? And you have multiples of them, but you want to serve them with one DMZ. Well, that can be done, right? But it's not exactly the way the model was built. Or you have enterprise services that you need to interact, down in the lower levels. Well, what are those rules? Well, we all make up our own rules because the Purdue model doesn't tell you how data flow works, right? And so it isn't terribly, you can definitely try to modify it and manipulate it into fitting into the paradigm that you're working in, but you're usually losing something in the process. And again, you're not really doing it of much of a favor. So in the new world, like I said, where we have new architectures, where we're integrating things like partner connections, government, regulatory connections, cloud, your IIoT, and myriad other things, robotics and UAVs, and where does all that sit? Building management systems for a long time weren't really thought of as traditional OT, but are very much thought of that way now. So it was time for an update.
Well, and I think another way of saying it is, in an OT environment, you've got all these diverse systems that might be serving a different function. If you're on a rig or you're some sort of vessel, you might have global positioning systems, and at the same rig, you have a lot of positioning systems with the actual, the rig itself. And so, how do you separate these into different systems? And you're saying that the Purdue model may not always be your friend to do that.
Yeah, and it encourages a certain kind of rigid thinking that we've all been very comfortable with for over a
Right.
decade.
Right.
And that is, well, I have these lines. I've drawn these lines, and now those lines were there to protect me from something on the other side of that line. Therefore, I'm inherently going to think in terms of those boundary protections at those lines,
Sure.
and fine. So you think in a very isolationist kind of way. That's fair until the day you need to export data to a supplier for machinery maintenance, or you need
Right.
to take data in from optimization models, or you need, suddenly that line starts looking very Swiss cheesy.
Well, and who
Um,
draws the lines? Who
well,
draws the lines, right? That's a big question.
right. So generally speaking, even organizations across all the industries and the various critical infrastructure sectors, the people who drew the lines were generally speaking the operations folks, right?
Right.
At
Because it was
least
functional.
initially.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
functional. They
because
didn't think about security. So I switched to the next slide where we're looking
yep,
at a
yep,
different example.
yeah. So this is still a Purdue model type model. And I will make an interesting point about that later, in that the Purdue model is, technically speaking, just a use case that you can represent in zones and conduits. But
Sure.
there is another standard out there that was generated by API. It's called API 1164, and they did this primarily for pipelines.
Mm.
And I was a reviewer and contributor to that as well. And they did an interesting thing. And they took the cybersecurity framework, the NIST cybersecurity framework, and they took 62443 and the zones and conduits concepts, and they drew a lot of connectivity between them, and said, you can compare cybersecurity capabilities to what you get from the particular zones and conduits. And one idea, because I don't want to claim credit for it, but one idea that I really liked was this concept of, we call them zones in the drawing. We've matured a little bit since then because it's confusing, but we call them layers now. So there's an external layer, intermediate layer, and an internal layer. And what that does is it says, okay, I can still have my zones, I can still have my conduits, I can still do all my, Z and C stuff.
Sure.
But if I think of them as habitating a particular layer, then I can use that context to apply more rules, guardrails, best practices, etc. And so now I can say, instead of X zone, I can say X zone that inhabits the internal layer. And because it inhabits the internal layer, it gets, these things inherently. And then I can say, well, this zone in the internal layer is perhaps speaking to a zone in the intermediate layer. Well, because they're crossing that layer boundary, there's extra conduit rules that I need to apply in those scenarios. And so that let people hold on to just that little bit of Purdue model that still made them feel comfortable, while letting us transition to zones and conduits. That was a lesson we learned pretty early on. This in particular is not detailed in 62443-3-2. The layer, the external, intermediate, and internal layer concept. That's a layer that I and others in my industry have applied to help us understand.
Well, the introduction of IP-based systems, the cybersecurity around that. The other thing that I always look at, Kenny, on this particular slide is, what are the personnel requirements from a training and a technical perspective? What do all the different players have to participate to effectively understand, well, which ones are low and which ones are high criticality? So you have to have operations players in there. Then when you look at OT or ICS based systems versus IT, the amount of, I think a big misconception is the amount of input post-install implementation and sale of a component or a PLC or anything at the component level, right? From a vendor, they may not hand over all of the configuration of the security for that. So you have this really complex web of players, I like to say.
Yep.
And would you not agree that kind of one of the foundational thesis of 3-2 was that because you have all these different components, because they all may have a different inherent vulnerabilities, right, at different times in the life cycle of the asset, it really does become this big stew of things, and all of them have different risks and there's different threats. And so would you not argue that step one, figure that out and be able to draw it out, make sure you have the right people in the room to define it, and then use 3-2 to work you through the process of the risk management for that?
Absolutely. So risk analysis, like I've gone on a bit much about it, but risk analysis is it's part art, part science. And I would argue that we're at least particularly in the OT space, but I think I could make a compelling argument in the IT space too, that we need a lot more. We need a lot more folks that are highly educated and experienced in that world. What the government calls knowledge, skills, and abilities. And what I found is that, like I said earlier, you do usually have folks that think in terms of risk. You got safety people right off the bat in any organization that has any safety issues. They've been thinking about risk for a long time, just not the same way, right? I found them to be true allies, and bringing them into the conversation is hugely helpful on the consequence and impact side of things, because they've been doing HAZOPs, LOPAs, PHAs, you name it, for decades and decades. So they are a wealth of knowledge in what is possible or not, right? So when you're talking about unmitigated worst case consequences and impacts, those are stars. Then you have vulnerability. Well, most of us have some kind of security operations center, threat intelligence, vulnerability management, patch management, et cetera, et cetera. You've got folks that are very keyed into that part of the equation. And I've kind of mentioned 2 in 1, right? I mentioned threat intelligence. So there's the threat side, and then you've got the vulnerability management people. Again, a lot of them, their history is mostly IT. But I find that the conversation about OT, usually the fiddly bits that are OT don't matter as much as the understanding of how we measure vulnerabilities and those kinds of things. Whether or not I can put Nmap in my environment is a different conversation from what I do with the results of it. Like, let me figure out how to do that, but you're the expert as a vulnerability management person in what I do with those kinds of results. But and then risk analysis itself, which what we've found is that there are a number of tools, there's a number of trainings, there's a number of risk geeks like me who are willing to kind of help them progress to the next level. But and the little last thing I'll say about that is, we are, as industries, we are far too reliant on intuition for risk assessment. Here's the question you do not want to not have an answer to when an executive asks you. When you go on and say, oh, look, we have deployed this risk assessment model, and we have this matrix, and we could tell you, we could create a dashboard and blah, blah, blah. And when the executive says, how do you know it's working? If you don't have an answer to that question, well, why were you doing anything you were doing, right? So the next level that we're now having to train people doing risk analysis is measuring how effective your identification techniques are, right?
I had a conversation with some folks, and I think it's going to kick off to another episode. I did an audits versus assessment podcast, I don't know, 6-8 weeks ago. We're going to do another one. I've got a special guest coming on, and my whole perspective, forget the word audit and assessment. My whole perspective is that the real true value of whether a program is effective is in the capacity to showcase a demonstrated, documented program that is continually improving. And I think that's what you're saying. So to finalize this, you and I align on that. To finalize this out, I just wanted to, for all of the entry level folks that may not have a great experience of what are zones and conduits and what are systems, you've got to understand it in simplified terms. So I'm a car guy. I like racing cars around a track. When you think about a car, you could think about that as your entire, maybe your facility, right? What is being asked upon the key stakeholders is to break up your facility into these systems under consideration, and then these zones and conduits, right? So if you think about a car that's moving really fast, you've got your tires, your brakes, and maybe your brake lines. That's a system because all of them create an output, right? When you think about your engine and your drivetrain, those all create basically an automation system. And so you can have, you're not just assessing in general the controls of the car, what 3-2 is asking you to think about is, I got to understand, how does the engine connect to the drivetrain, to the transmission, and the drive line? Same thing goes with the brakes and the tires. Do you agree with that kind of breakdown of, you have to break up all these components, and the sum of these systems are what create your automation system, and then you can start thinking about the vulnerabilities and the threats and the mitigating controls?
Yeah, absolutely. And I use a lot of analogies too. You are required. I mean, it's literally what's called a zones and conduits requirement to aggregate or group your assets by functional and operational purpose. And so if you have, for example, a safety system that is functionally doing one thing, that needs to be in a zone. You have a leak detection system that deserves its own zone potentially. Again, the standard does not tell you how you, random consumer, are going to break up your system. You have to decide that. That's, by the way, as a flashback to a second ago, that's where you get the operations folks involved, because they're the ones
Absolutely.
who understand. They know functionally, these things are functionally related. These things
That's
are
right.
not functionally related to that. There's actually been, we've had conversations about printers. Where do printers go,
Where do
right?
they
I mean,
sit in it? Right. Yeah.
they're functionally not a SCADA system or a DCS, right? So where do they go? But anyway, I would say bigger picture though, one of the most important things about zones and conduits is that it requires something that, while we all knew intuitively we ought to be doing, we've never really been doing. And that is capture, and it helps with the life cycle. So you mentioned the life cycle. If you don't do this, you really can't do a life cycle. There are a number of what they call characteristics for zones and conduits. And there's 14 of them. They're in the document. They're on page 23 if you want to go look it up in the document. I'm not going to sit here and recite all of them, but they are things like the accountable organization or accountable asset owner, the definition of where the boundary is around that grouping of assets,
Physical
what the
access points, logical
physical
access
access point. Yep,
points.
yep,
That's right. Applicable security policies
yep.
for the
And
defined zones and conduits. Yep.
so when you go to a business unit or a field operations group or whatever part of your, your organization, the folks who deal with this stuff day to day, the hands-on experts for that equipment and those assets, and you give them this list, I mean, they just turn white, right? They're like, well,
I do.
how long is that going to take, and how hard is that going to be? And I'm like, well, okay, let's just get ready up front. It is going to be a bit of a haul because you're doing something now that has never been done before. By the way, all that data exists in your head, but it isn't on paper. And even if you wrote it down on paper, would it still be right, a month from now or a year from now? So we have to think in terms of the cycle that keeps this
Right.
stuff alive and getting it out of people's heads onto paper. And once they realize that, well, actually, if I show up with a pen and a paper and say, you don't have to do anything except tell me things, I'm going to put that down for you. I mean, it's a little more complicated than a pen and paper, but usually they're a lot more amenable to that process. But if you don't have those characteristics, game over.
Well, and I think if you don't have a good understanding of your overall threats, your overall,
Sure.
a risk matrix. So that bodes really well to what I think are, so we're at 10:45, and I think it's okay if we go over a little bit over, but let's spend a good 10 minutes on the next 2 or 3 slides where we're going to actually dive into some of the 3-2 workflows. So how does somebody get started? Obviously, you got to bring in your key stakeholders. Obviously, you have to have some data models, right? How do we start putting that together, Kenny?
So there's brownfield and greenfield. So greenfield, much easier. When you're developing a brand new system, it's never been deployed. You're building effectively a new industrial automation control system. This is a way easier conversation because you get in at the beginning.
You get to define it. Yeah, you get to define it.
Yeah, and so you can do design and development specs and all kinds of things. But the world we normally live in is brownfield, which is, well, I already have tens or hundreds or thousands of assets. They all already live in these environments. They're already Purdue model-ish, right? And you want to come in and you want to change things. And I bet what you mean, I'm playing the part of the asset owner at this point. I bet what you mean is you want to sprinkle firewall dust on everything, and that's how you're going to solve all the problems. And where are you going to get the money? And by the way, I have a 5-year business plan, and are you going to be part of blah, blah, blah. So where we start is we take the existing architecture and we go, all right, can we, as people kind of outside of the operational organization, can we look at what they have and propose that in the workflow? There's an initial proposed zones and conduits model.
Right.
In some cases, I mean, particularly if it's a simple environment, that's not terribly difficult, right? And again, by the way, it sounds easy, but identifying that first step up there at the top, identifying the system under consideration,
Sure.
sounds easy. Starting up a conversation about where the DMZ starts and where the DMZ ends and whether the DMZ is owned by the enterprise or by the, I mean, it gets fuzzy pretty quick sometimes. Once you can sort of establish those initial foundational concepts in relation to the environment you're looking at, you can propose, usually without a lot of effort, a sort of first pass, because we have a lot of very similar assets in these environments, right? I speak for oil and gas. I know electric and wastewater and everybody else has their own, but we have DCSs and fire and gas systems and safety systems, and it's the same stuff. We have PI historians and blah 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 blah. We try to create a template up front that says we propose that we know where these things go, and we're going to come to you with that initial templatized proposal, and hopefully that environment that we're approaching won't have to change things much. And we did that by engaging our architecture community, publishing these as sort of engineering standard templates. And so we can jump over a lot of the initial, what do we do now? And, come at you with a predefined template that says, I think it's like this. What do you think? And that's how you start at the top of this. Then you have to start going through, once you establish that I have functionally grouped these things appropriately, I have said nothing about risk. I've said nothing about security yet. That's when you start having the conversation and go, okay, look, some of these zones are obviously high criticality. Your DCS is almost always going to be the highest criticality, right? Because that's what is doing cyber physical control. So let's start there. And then you have the risk conversation and say, like your car, well, brakes, how important are brakes? Pretty important on a race car, right? So let's forget about everything else and just focus on that. We have inputs, we have outputs. They're a self-contained functional asset group. Let's now look at, well, what happens if they go out, right? Like, that's the easy part. We, across all critical infrastructure, we're really good at consequences and impacts. We've been establishing what the possible consequences and impacts are for literally hundreds of years. So that's first step. And then you start working your way sort of to the left where you go, well, what are the inherent vulnerabilities in all of this, right? Where were the brake lines made? Where was your brake fluid made? How often do you change it? Those kinds of things. So you start building a model of what that looks like. And then, of course, well, what's threatening me? Well, heat is threatening me. Erosion, corrosion, in the case of a car. The aggressors are much more flexible and agile when it comes to cybersecurity. But, you start forming that picture. And once you have those components understood and you think that you have your zone clearly demarcated, then you start developing those characteristics that we talked about a minute ago, those 14 that are on page 23 of the standard. You start looking at, all right, well, what boundary, how important is this zone so important that it needs X level of boundary protection? We measure all of these things by what's called a security level. So what you're doing in that exercise is establishing a security level. And you're saying, well, okay, I need to defend myself against, in the case of a car, crashes and fire and blah, blah, blah. Probably not quite the same level you'd need for a commuter car. So, you will establish a different security level in those two scenarios. Coming to that is where the real rubber meets the road. Haha.
That was unplanned. That was
it was unplanned. Anyway, so I mean that's how you begin the conversation.
Well, and I think another thing is, so how applicable is this new wrench we'll throw into the engine is that you have different use cases for those brake systems and that system under consideration. You might be on a track that has 40 turns versus 5, right? Do you see the actual critical this is what I always see is you see some critical infrastructure assets, like large assets with different systems under consideration that might be going through some operational changes or operational differences based on how the operator is going to be running that system. And how does that play into the 3-2 workflow as just one more data model or data trend?
Yeah, so I tend to call that business context.
Exactly.
I think lots of people have different names for it, but I call it business context. In the broad scheme of risk analysis models, and they're all pretty much the same. That goes by several names: business context, extenuating factors, contributing factors. It's another input into your overall analysis. Generally speaking, it affects, to a greater or lesser degree, some aspects of your vulnerability side of things, your consequence side of things, because it's not so much that the operators are often doing things differently. It's that they have a business reason for doing it differently. And if that is disrupted, if their particular needs are not being met, that is a compromise, be it cyber or otherwise. They would consider that a compromise. Normally I click a button and the valve opens, becomes I get on the radio and I roll a guy in a truck. The valve will still open, but I'm not doing it the way I want to do it when I pick up the radio, right? And so you would look at that as a potential consequence, and you measure those consequences in terms of, the actual impact value, right?
Well, the thing I like about it is it's constantly evaluating what are my changes in the business outcomes or the business context. What about this? So I want to spend a little more time here, because I think we're really in a place where people might be able to learn more. How much so we had some comments earlier about how do you feel about bringing in somebody like ISO Secure or maybe some certification body versus building this internal. So it's a little bit of part to answer that question. When you think about the time it takes to go through these various steps, and we haven't even gotten to the detailed risk assessment, right? As you take a look at who on your team, whether you're bringing in outside consultants, whether you're building it internally, as you think about the OT brain drain and where skill sets are, talk a little bit about who those key stakeholders need to be and when are you bringing them in based on kind of the timeline of this workflow, Kenny. Is this days? Is this weeks? Is this months? Do I want to break down the different steps in Q1 and then I want to get budget to go after the next steps in Q2? I know there's a lot there in those questions, but tell the audience a little bit from your perspective, best way to manage those, I think, constraints, right? Budget and time.
Yeah, I feel like it's a hair club for men. I'm not just the owner, but I'm also a customer, right? So, as a customer of this, I definitely have a lot to say on the topic. There were not a lot of outside groups that you could invite in to help you not too long ago. I say the ISCI, the ISA Secure Compliance Institute that I'm a part of, we don't do that. That's actually not part of what that group does. What we do is we deal with the suppliers and vendors, and we say we will certify your products to be accredited at a certain security level. So you can then go to an asset owner and say, I want to sell you this product. By the way, here's my certification, which guarantees to you or assures you that I've met these various cybersecurity requirements in 62443. That's one. So that provides us a base for products that we know just by the sticker on the box are going to meet our needs, depending on the security level we've established for a zone. So I have a zone, that security level is, let's say security level 2. I need security level 2 products. I have suppliers that are now getting certifications that say, yes, my product is certified to that level. By the way, if you're in safety, that's safety instrumentation level, very, very similar concept. It was built around that same concept. So from the outside, that's not so much. What you really do want access to is organizations, SecurityGate, the big head shops, consultants, etc., that are deeply ingrained in this concept. And I would say, I'm not going to name any names, but there are large consulting organizations that have done over the last 4 or 5 years a pretty good job of buying the knowledge, skills, and abilities they need to enter this game. I'll leave it there. But there's a lot of folks in those organizations now that do have this understanding that can come in and help you start this journey. They understand how to do what's called ChazOps, cybersecurity HazOps. They understand how to do risk analysis with the objective of declaring security levels, et cetera, et cetera. And then internally, your procurement departments, they need to understand how to speak this language. because, they're typically not in the weeds. They're just trying to acquire assets for you within your own organization, but they need to understand enough about this to know what to ask for. So instead of sending someone a
No,
30-page
it's
questionnaire on
totally.
cyber,
You
just
got
say, do you
to.
have a certification?
I mean, it's the difference between a project and a real program. It's the difference between a program and an initiative. I think the latter two, programs and initiatives, you got to pull in all these stakeholders, and everybody has to have at least a general understanding of what's the mission we're trying to do with this 62443 series of standards. Okay, we're going to get some people aligned with just the basics, right? But 3-2, we're going to pull in all these people. As a previous external auditor myself, my role was to come in and judge the effectiveness of primarily oil and gas companies, programs, systems to a known standard, right? There's a lot of value in bringing in a consultant that can come in for a short period of time, either to kick off the program or to help you kind of rally, especially if you don't have the right training. But I would also argue that if the asset owner doesn't take it upon themselves to get educated, to really invest the resources of time, of sending your people to a school, then when a product is brought in to help you do some of this, risk or controls identification, then you bring a consultant in to do it on top. I feel like it has less of a chance that it's going to survive. And I
Yep.
think the asset owners, I'm back to square one. Like, yes, we have a ton of vendors, ton of knowledge, ton of really cool functionality. Even the vendors using the great products isn't as powerful. It's like a 5 to 1x, in my opinion. If you have an asset owner that knows exactly what he or she's trying to achieve and at least enables the team to be a part of that, and then uses these tools and these people in a way to achieve that. Because if you don't have that, I've just seen too many times the program falls apart. And I think that's one of the misconceptions about 3-2 is either you have to do it all yourself or you have to bring someone else in. I'll give you the last word on that before we kind of wrap things up.
Yeah, you absolutely have to build what we call the organizational capability internally.
Right.
I will say from my experience, and I've dealt with several different organizations within the industry, we all kind of agree that the best way to get there is you got to start, because management wants to see action, right? So you usually start with bringing in outside resources that are experts in this with two implicit directives. One is help me get started. The other is train me how to keep it going once you're gone.
Right.
And typically that's,
Teach me to fish.
and you asked a question earlier. I apologize, I did not answer. How long does this take? What does the
Right.
roadmap look like for
Right.
this? In a really big organization with lots and lots of industrial automation control system environments, so like big regional electric or big global oil and gas and those kinds of things, you're looking at a year's plus journey, right? Like it could be a 5-year journey. One particular operating group within that, one operations segment of your company, it's still easily a year plus to get something like this done. Because again, like I said, brownfield, it's very static. Those systems, those environments, they're built to be relatively unchanging. And so you're going to have architectural challenges because those environments really don't accept change well.
Right.
And you also have safety and just general reliability issues, right? Like you don't want to go in there, disrupt. I mean, it's the cash register. At the end of the day, these entire organizations exist to support those operational environments.
Right.
And to come in there and wave the new thing flag is a pretty dangerous thing. So you need people who not only understand 62443, understand the workflow, have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to execute these various aspects, understand the architecture, understand the operational business context, but they also need to understand the people. Because you're interacting with people, and that's, I'm not trying to put too much light on it, but it's their baby, and it's been their baby for 30 years. And you want to come and do what? So there's a lot of that.
That's exactly right. Well, given the amount of time that we have left, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna skip over 2 of the slides and go straight to the when, because that's a real question that you're talking about. If it's going to take a major organization multiple years to get this rolled out, get your folks trained, I'm on the opposite end. I think that you can get started pretty quickly, especially if you're not looking at the enterprise rollout across all your
Right.
facilities or critical assets. Let's just take one. Let's say one chemical facility. And I see people doing this effectively. They're taking a little bit more of an agile approach. But regardless of how big of a bite of an apple that you want to take, when is the right time to kind of get these programs off the ground, Kenny?
Well, now, yesterday would have been ideal. And the reason I say that is not because I'm just some sort of, shill for 62443, but
Right.
because what it gives me as a practitioner
Mhm.
is the ability to answer a lot of questions when it comes to modernizing technology
Mhm.
that we would have to inherently say no to without the flexibility that something like zones and conduits brings to the party. So when you come and say, hey, look, I want to, do the next big industry 5.0, or I want to cloud base all of my remote access, or I want to buy cheap IoT devices and use that to do blah blah blah. um you know as it stands today, the answer is oftentimes you can't. Sorry,
Right.
that doesn't fit into the model. So if I want to support those kinds of things, growth, um the scope of expandability, et cetera, I've got to go this way. There's no
Right.
other way around it. So,
There's no bad
short
time to
answers
get
now.
started. Well, there's no bad time to get started. I think a lot of people, you know, a lot of process oriented, data oriented people feel, well, I've got to get all these things together and I have to make sure that everything is perfect. But life happens and operational things happen. And so I see from my vantage point a lot of global asset owners being pushed from non-technical players, whether that's the board of directors, maybe that's the CFO, that are starting to ask real tough questions. Hey, we understand you have a cyber budget. We understand that you're doing a lot. We've got great qualified people. How do we know if it's working? And how do we know if we're better than the next guys? And how are we connecting all these growing investments like this to a real output that we know is driving to the bottom line? And I think, I shared in the pre-live with you that if there was ever a time that OT security could make its way out of the bucket of cost center like IT and into an enabling center, the time is now. And that's the reason that we put the show together. And as our kind of closing thoughts, I threw a couple questions up here, and you can answer maybe all together. But for folks listening in, what are the top 2 or 3 things that drive the foundation for a really successful 3-2 program? We talked a lot about time, so we can skip that one. And then with those top 3 ingredients, where do you think people make mistakes in the process that after many years of either defining it or rolling it out yourself, that you could help people avoid potentially?
Yeah, I would say the first thing I harp on every time is, we as, like I said, industry groups are trying to use risk-based decision making.
Mm-hmm.
I use the air quotes because that sometimes is a little bit lip service, and what happens is you use impact-based risk decision making, where people say, well, this could result in some great impact, and so I'm going to treat it like it's high risk. That is not an accurate statement. So if we're
Mm-hmm.
going to do risk-based anything, and zones and conduits is extremely risk-based,
Sure.
you have to have really clear understanding of how to identify, analyze both qualitatively and quantitatively risk. So without a doubt, that's step one.
Okay.
The second ingredient is you really have to have very strong partnership. I'm, there is an IT OT challenge that has existed for
Right.
a long time.
Right.
You really have to step across that aisle, so to speak, and say, hey, look, we're all in this together. We're trying to accomplish a goal as least impactfully for you as possible. You need to get those relationships created and really firm, because they're going to be tested. I guarantee it. And then I guess if I had to pick a third thing to really get going is you need the folks that really came out of operations into
Mm-hmm.
your cyber organization
Love
to
it.
help lead this charge, because those folks are worth their weight in gold. And I hope none of them hear that and run away, because they could probably go get 3 times the money somewhere else. But
Mm-hmm.
they're really unique individuals, and they're absolutely necessary. If you're bringing in outside consultants, you need those folks because they speak their language.
Totally.
If you're doing the bridge building with the operations people, well, they came from there, so they get it. But they're absolutely cybersecurity people. That's really important. And then I would say the top mistake or regret. Well, some of it is you didn't do the three things I just said, which is usually what's going to bite you.
Right.
I would say is you don't build enough time.
Mm.
You what happens is you make promises to management. You tell them how long you think it's going to take. Management does what management does, and I don't fault them for it. But they're thinking in a different level, and they're like, okay, you have half the time and half the money, and then you wind up cutting corners, and you don't want to wind up with a prettier, shinier Purdue model at the end of the day.
Right.
That's not going to help anybody. So I think you really need to spend some time. You would regret not spending the time truly communicating the business context, the resource needs, the timelines, all of the budgets, all of that to executives, because they make decisions every day based on people not communicating that stuff very well.
That's right.
So they're making intuition-based decisions as well. And your regret is you got shortchanged because you didn't represent yourself well enough. That's probably
represent the end state, right? So
correct.
The entire business of cyber discussion started in early Q2 on a singular idea, and you've touched on a lot of those components, which is it is the security and risk management leaders' new and evolving job to talk to non-technical executives about what is the end state, how do we connect that end state of cybersecurity to business outcomes. Yep. And instead of only talking about the best products, only talking about the best UI, only talking about the best vulnerabilities, one of the things that I caught in the last 2 or 3 minutes of your statements was you got to align your teams better. You have to communicate better. You have to make sure you plan enough time for these things. You got to make sure that you pull in, grow the ecosystem of security leaders with operational leaders that know how to connect their cybersecurity investments to business outcomes. So I'm totally aligned, and I really appreciate your last comments. I appreciate everything you've done. If we wouldn't mind focusing on the people, there's a couple questions that came from the audience as people might be starting to trickle out. A gentleman named Bruce asked, in building an effective and efficient risk management program for third-party selection and qualification of control systems platform, how do you see industry certification programs such as ISA Secure contributing to an enduring program establishment and rollout versus rolling out your own OT security evaluation on spreadsheets or other capture approaches? I know there's a lot there, but what are your thoughts, Kenny?
If I understand the question correctly, it's kind of the old procurement model, new procurement model, or old supply chain, new supply chain question. So the whole point of ISCI, and by the way, there are other bodies out there that are attempting the same thing. I'm biased. I think ISCI is doing the better job, but your mileage varies. But what they're trying to do is give us that ask, right? So how can I stop depending on procurement professionals who absolutely understand the supply chain, but they aren't technical specialists in these various assets and products that they're trying to buy? They depend on us, the technical experts within the companies. And what that usually boils down to is, the spreadsheet, right? Every solution has a spreadsheet behind it somewhere. The way you avoid that is you help mature these compliance organizations, because right now they can certify through SL2. There are 4 security levels, SL 1 through 4. They can currently certify through 2. They're working on 3 and so forth. I mean, it's a journey. We need to encourage the vendors to participate in these certification schemes. And I mean, I'm never going to be in favor of penalizing a vendor over this kind of stuff. But we do want to encourage vendors. And in some cases, engaging with the old model of supply chain management is painful. It's painful for us. It's painful for the vendor. No one really likes going through the spreadsheet game. And if you can say, hey, look, we've submitted our products for testing. We now have like I said, a sticker on the box. Now you have an advertising and marketing opportunity as a vendor, and as an asset owner, you're definitely going to be high in the decision matrix, because I don't really have to do a lot of work.
Assurance. Well, I think his question came from, if I'm going to roll out 3-2, whether I'm on the product side or whether I'm on the asset owner side. Do I want to go to an organization? I think it's two-part question, because if you go to ISO Security, get some sort of certification, that certification is to a lot of times the secure design lifecycle. I think what his question was, should I bring in an organization to drive 3-2 adoption from maybe a consulting organization, or should I just roll it out in my own like kind of spreadsheet? And where my perspective is, it depends. It depends.
The least satisfying answer, but the accurate answer.
Well, look, it depends, because it depends on your resource allocation. How much time, budget, and energy do you want to put towards it? I think there's a lot of energy right now to consulting organizations doing more and more of these. What they're finding out there, folks, is that some of the intricate data models required to effectively run this program have not been done. So I would say if you're at some state of a maturity where you do have a risk matrix established, you do understand what controls you have, you do understand your systems under consideration, bringing in a third party could be really effective. But I would also argue that if you haven't done like a controls-based gap assessment in the last 3 years, that consultant's tab is going to go astronomically higher, and your timeline is going to be extended, because the foundation for a really effective and efficient 3-2 workflow may not be there.
Right. So I would argue that, to your it depends side of that, it does. So if you are in an organization that's large enough if you have enough bandwidth in your SME pool to get some people dedicated to understanding and learning about this, you're obviously off to a far better start. Because while I do not think any third-party partner is inherently being malicious or anything, you do need some way to validate what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And so if you bring someone in to be the resident expert for hire for a short period of time, you have to have the internal capacity to at least validate what's being said. So, you're not left with...
Go to training, visit next week.
Go to training, read, join ISA 99, right. Get involved, right? Because we owe it to ourselves to validate what others are telling us. And in a lot of cases, you get a sort of entrenched packaged consulting advice. And while maybe that applied really well to something, it may not apply to you. And you need to be able to validate that. Number two, you are bringing in third parties to help you more to teach you how to do it than to, quote, do it for you.
Hopefully.
Well, that should be your objective.
That's what the executives want.
That should be your objective. Yeah. So the first few rounds of this really ought to, in my mind, be more proof of concept while you teach me. Sure. And then, contract ends, we continue on with what we've learned. That's the ideal case. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we are at about 14 minutes over, but this has been fun. As we go to the final slide, I just wanted to thank you, Kenny, for coming in. We've had a lot of really great comments. There's just so many comments that we can't cover them all. But I think that folks hopefully found value in this discussion. I know I did. The link to operations, the link to understanding the total outcome that you're trying to achieve was really insightful. So Kenny, thank you for really being part of the show.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I enjoyed it. Yeah. Like I said, I have a lot of passion around this. I could go on forever.
No, totally. Well, join us next week. This is the Business of Cyber series. We're going to be diving in once again on a 62443 topic. This time, we're going to be talking about certificates as well as the training to get them. There's 4 different training courses that ISA offers, correlated directly to the substandards or the sub-chapters of the 62443 series. And we're going to be diving in with somebody who just got all 4, making him the stage 5 expert. And we're really excited about diving that in. After that, we're going to be talking about the differences between OT and IT sites with another really special guest. And looks like, with y'all's support, we can continue to keep growing this as a real difference maker in the ecosystem as we talk about the allocation of people, time, and budget towards cybersecurity. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.